Hi friends, welcome to A Wonderful Sheep and welcome to my April reading wrap-up video. This time I actually did film some of the journaling for the monthly review, so you get some journal with me footage as I talk about the books I read in April. I read a pretty diverse assortment of books. Here I am just laying out all the book covers I've printed out, and I'll sort them by category or how I want to journal about them, not necessarily in chronological order. There's some graphic novels, some historical romance, and some contemporary romance and nonfiction. And overall, it was a pretty, like I said, diverse, balanced reading month, I think. I got some books off of my TBR list done, and I got some books that I've been meaning to read for a long time, like this first book, which was Siddhartha by Herman Hesse. This has been on my to-read list for years. I think I remember first hearing about it back in high school, and I will confess I didn't know exactly what it was about because I thought it was a story about the life of the Buddha. But it's actually about a young man's journey to seek enlightenment after he meets the Buddha. And this is on like a lot of famous people's like favorite books list, and I've always wanted to read it. So I tackled this book this month, and I finally found out the origin of this quote I had seen before. I can think, I can wait, I can fast. I think this is a really good book to reread later on. I definitely don't think I can absorb everything in one read, and also it'll probably hit me differently in different parts of my life, stages of my life. So I would like to return to it, but there were some good quotes that gave me a lot of food for thought. Next up is the last book that's out so far in the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. It's so funny that when I first read Sarah J. Maas, I didn't like the first book I read, which was ACOTAR, A Court of Thorns and Roses. But because she was so popular, and because even if I didn't really like ACOTAR, I wanted to know what happened in the series, I continued with that series. And then I ventured into Throne of Glass at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And I quite liked that series. And then I ventured into the third series that she's written, which is Crescent City. And this is the last book, the third book, which is A House of Flame and Shadow. And you saw that I made a mistake in the acronym for the book. So I had to cover that up to make it HOFAS, HOFAS. And I think the first book in the series made the biggest impression on me, and again, like she's a great storyteller and a great world builder, so I wanted to keep on with the series, and there were some great moments that I really liked. I won't give any spoilers, don't read too closely at the writing here if you don't want to be spoiled at all, but I did like that the Sarah J. Maas-verse sort of all ties together in this third book, and there were of course some heartbreaking moments because Sarah J. Maas is ruthless when she comes to what she does with her characters. But yeah, overall I felt like it was a good ending, a sort of a good conclusion to the series and some of the characters that we've been introduced to both on page through the series and then off page. And before we move on to the next book, I realized I didn't give you a summary of what House of Flame and Shadow is, which I tend to do if the book is in the middle of a series. But the Crescent City series follows Bryce, the female main character, who is this half-fae, half-human person who navigates the brutal world of Crescent City, where fae and humans and angels and werewolves and all manner of creatures live, not quite in peace, but in sort of a governed coexistence. And the first book sort of is a mystery fantasy. There's more of a like mystery aspect in it. And then the rest of the books are more of a traditional fantasy story arc. And like I said, I was not an immediate fan of Sarah J. Maas, but now she has become an auto-read author for me. I will definitely be picking up whatever book is published next because I'm invested in all of these series. And then the next book is The Art of Possibility by Rosamund Stone Zander and Benjamin Zander. This was another book that was on my TBR from like celebrity recommendations. I think I found out about this book through Tim Ferriss. And it is a nonfiction, like a self-help book. I think the title perfectly encapsulates what the book is about, which is the art of possibility. So breaking down like the worldviews and mindsets that are limiting and calculating and small, and like expanding yourself to welcome possibility. I didn't realize I had so many takeaways from this book before I started this wrap-up journaling session, but then looking back through my highlights, I realized there were a lot of good points that I resonated with, but I probably will need a reread of this book sometime later to really digest them. But I think this one quote that I'd written down sort of sums up this book. Every problem, every dilemma, every dead end we find ourselves facing in life only appears unsolvable inside a particular frame or point of view. Enlarge the box or create another frame around the data, and problems vanish while new opportunities appear. And the book makes this distinction between the calculating self, which is probably our default setting that we've become trained to be, where we are judging, we are limiting ourselves, everything needs to be given a grade, and it's a competition. It is a zero-sum game where if someone has more, then that means I get less. But then if we can try to view things through the central self, this is another quote, the central self always appraises the truth of the whole situation without guile or agenda. And it also says, we are all fundamentally immeasurable and we all belong. So yeah, another book that was worthwhile reading, but will also need a reread. Next up are two audiobooks that I was actually introduced to thanks to a comment on one of my YouTube videos. So thank you so much for that recommendation. They are All Creatures Great and Small and All Things Bright and Beautiful by James Herriot, read by Christopher Timothy. And these were perfect to have on in the background as I was doing errands or journaling, because they're just these very lighthearted, charming, sometimes heartwarming, sometimes just silly and funny collection of stories about being a country vet in that time period. And the style reminded me a lot of P.G. Wodehouse from the Bertie and Jeeves stories. And so these were just sort of lighthearted way to like fall into a time period, escape into that world, and you didn't have to pay too much attention. It wasn't too strenuous. It was just a nice way to pass some time. Next up, you can see I have a very elaborate spread dedicated to Vari McFarlane's backlist, because I found out she has a new book coming out this year and I loved all of her recent releases, so I wanted to catch up on her backlist. And the first book I read was Here's Looking at You, and I gotta say, I think I like her recent releases better. This book is about Anna, who is this beautiful, very smart history professor, and she has to work with this man named James, who actually is from her past. He was a bully to her. He was quite cruel to her back in high school, but when they meet again as adults, he doesn't realize who she is. And so there's a little bit of like hidden identity, and then I don't know if it's enemies to lovers, but obviously it's a romance, so they do get together. But I think I just never connected with their story because I couldn't get over how mean he was to her back in high school, and I just never got on board with her forgiving him for that, even though he does explain like why he did what he did. I never got on board. So that was not as much of a fun read for me as her other releases. And then Who's That Girl? It's actually the book that the new book that's coming out this year is a sequel to. So I hadn't read that before. So I listened to the audio, and once again, I didn't really connect with this book as much either. So in this book, Edie is forced to leave her London office because she's ostracized at work, and she becomes a celebrity ghostwriter for this up-and-coming actor, Elliot, and forced proximity, brings the two closer together. But I guess I didn't get as invested in this book because it was audio, and the people at her old workplace were just so toxic. It was really kind of a bummer to listen to. So I didn't like this one as much either, but still love this author and I'm excited for her new book. In April, I continued my streak of reading graphic novels and memoirs. The first was Impossible People by Julia Wertz, which is the author's story of her 5-year journey to sobriety. And then Kid Gloves by Lucy Knisley, which is her pregnancy and birthing story. And I just like art illustration. I like supporting art and illustrators. So graphic memoirs are kind of a fun way to read about other people's experiences, but mostly through pictures. And so they're easy to get through. You can finish them in a sitting. And yeah, I will continue to read more graphic memoirs moving forward. And then I started the Inheritance Games series. It's a young thriller mystery by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. And it's about Avery, our female protagonist, who is barely making by. She's literally living out of her car when she suddenly gets noticed that she's been left a fortune of over $1 billion by an eccentric rich man. And the caveat is she has to live in the house of the very rich family for 1 year before she can accept the money. And it's very young adult. I think it was a little too young adult for me. That said, I did read 3 books in the series, but it has a lot of like puzzling, like riddles and puzzles you have to figure out to solve the mystery of the inheritance, first of all, and also the family's secrets. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of the Westing Game, which I read back when I was a young adult in like middle school or early high school. But yeah, it was a little too young adult for me. It felt a little too like fantasies of a young girl for me, but it was entertaining at the time. I didn't finish the 4th book in the series though. Next are the contemporary romances, and first up we have You with a View by Jessica Joyce, and the one-line blurb for the book reads, 2 high school enemies must reunite for a road trip inspired by their grandparents' broken engagement in this electric debut romance. So we follow Noelle, who is sort of directionless in her life right now. She's unemployed, and she's also grieving the loss of her grandmother. And she discovers this old photo of her grandma with another man that is not her grandfather. And so she posts it to TikTok, hoping to find out who he is, and connects with the man's grandson, who turns out to be her high school rival, Theo. And romance things happen so that Noelle, Theo, and Theo's grandfather all go on this road trip together. And I actually enjoyed the road trip aspect of like following along in my imagination as they go from like Death Valley and then through Zion Canyon, Bryce Canyon, and all of those like major landmarks in the West and Southwest. And I think that theme of sort of being disappointed with how adulthood turned out compared to what you expected it to be like when you were a kid is relatable at, some point in your life. And yeah, I would recommend. Next up, we have Emily Henry's new book, Funny Story. This was such a fun read. Emily Henry is the queen of rom-coms for me. I love her books, and this one did not disappoint. We follow Daphne, who is the female main character, and she has her world turned upside down one day when her fiancé comes home and tells her that he's leaving her for his childhood best friend. And so suddenly Daphne has to move out of their shared home, and she doesn't know many people in this town, so she ends up moving in with Miles, who is the ex-boyfriend of said childhood best friend. Ex-boyfriend of her old fiancé's new girlfriend, right? And so we have a forced proximity situation going on. At first, they are both brokenhearted and they're individually, respectively, nursing their broken hearts. But then in an effort to sort of get over their exes and maybe make their exes a little jealous, they start posting photos that insinuate they're together. And then we have a fake dating situation, which of course will turn into real feelings. And this book just does what a good romantic comedy is supposed to do. It makes you smile, it makes you laugh, and it makes you happy. It leaves you happy at the end. Also, I forgot to mention that Daphne is a children's librarian, and Emily Henry does such a good job writing about bookish people for bookish readers. So if you're anything like me and you like reading about book people, you're definitely going to enjoy like the romanticized version of being a children's librarian in this book. The next book is also a new release. It is Abby Jimenez's Just for the Summer. It's book 3 in the Part of Your World series, which you don't have to read the first 2 books to enjoy this one, but it is fun if you have read them because the characters from the previous novels make guest appearances in this book, and it's kind of fun to catch those Easter eggs. But we follow Justin, who is our male main character, and he has this thing where every time he dates someone and then they break up, the next person she dates ends up being her soulmate. And he has this sort of curse. And Emma is our female main character, and she has the same thing. And so they like end up connecting online, and they joke about dating each other so they could break up and then go on to meet their respective soulmates. And that joke actually turns into reality when Emma moves to the town where Justin is. They have a fake dating arrangement with like a deadline to break up at the end. But of course, fake dating turns into real feelings and love blooms. But it's not so easy as that because there's some complications with emotional baggage and family matters, mother-daughter, mother-son relationships. And Abby Jimenez is never afraid to tackle like hard issues or situations in her books, but she does it really well. And I wrote in my journal that I have 56 highlights from this book, a mix of like funny lines, profound insight, and secondhand therapy, and the little inside jokes from the characters appearing from her other books, and also places to visit in Minnesota. So she really she makes Minnesota sound like a really fun place to visit or live. And I always get secondhand therapy from her books. So also really enjoyed this one, also recommend it. And finally, last but certainly not least, are the historical romances, my comfort genre. I read 4 books in this category, and the first is Castles by Julie Garwood. This was book 4 in the Crown Spy series, and if you're new to Julie Garwood, I would recommend starting with The Gift, which is book 3 in the series. I think that was the best one. Castles was just okay. There was this like evil villain subplot in this book that I didn't really love. So if you'd like to check her out, I would recommend starting with The Gift, and you'll get a sense of her style and her voice, which is fun. But The Gift was the best one, I think. And then there was also A Governess's Guide to Passion and Peril by Manda Collins. This was also book 4 in a series. This was the Ladies' Guide series, and I have read the first 3. They're fun. They're kind of all sort of investigative, sort of mystery thriller historical romances, and this one actually also had a villain murderer subplot. There's these murders or like mysterious deaths that happen, and so our main female character Jane has to team up with our male main character Adrian Felding to find out who's doing these dastardly deeds. But I think my 2 favorite historicals from these 4 were Courtney Milan's The Marquis Who Mustn't and Sherry Thomas' The Luckiest Lady in London. Courtney Milan's book was the second book in the Wedgeford Trials series, and I did read the first book, which was The Duke Who Didn't, I believe. Yes, and I remember that book being very curious about brown sauce from that book. And I actually like the second book even better than the first. It's set in Regency, England, but the main characters are of Chinese descent, and Naomi is the female main character, and she has this passion to take ambulance lessons, like to become a certified ambulance staff person so she can help people medically, but her parents don't want her to do that. And the only way she could do that is, to have the permission of her fiancé. And she makes up a fake fiancé who actually is technically her real fiancé, affianced from when they were children. And that is Kai. But Kai returns to the town that he used to live in, but he has sort of a dark past. He has some secrets in the past that they have to overcome. But the book had some really interesting like themes and explorations of ideas of and like perceptions of what it means to be loved and feel lovable and how we perceive love in other relationships that I thought was really interesting. And finally, a new to me author, Sherry Thomas, I found out through the Fated Mates podcast, which is my source for most of my romance and historical romance book recommendations. But Sherry Thomas is also a Chinese American author, and a fun fact about her is that she moved to the US when she was 13, and she like learned English or improved her English by reading really thick romance novels with a Chinese English dictionary, which is very cool. And so her writing feels a lot more authentic to the time period. Like she uses a lot of vocabulary that I have to look up because it feels like it's like, for example, other historical romances will use the word carriage, but in her book she uses broom, or like the names of foods and like the way foods are prepared and everything. And also you can tell she does a lot of research into her books because their characters often have like sort of not obsessions, but they're really passionate about astronomy or factories or like industrialization. And there's a lot of like historical context to her books as well. So I did start some of her books, and the first one I read was The Luckiest Lady in London. From this trilogy, I would actually recommend the second book, Private Arrangements, over this one. I don't think you have to read these in order. They're all standalone as is. But yeah, I think I'll talk more about Sherry Thomas in my May reading wrap-up because I read a ton of her books at the beginning of the month. But that is it for all the books I read in April. I think my favorite books from the month were, in terms of reading experience, just like a fun reading experience, were Funny Story by Emily Henry and Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. And then I will probably at some point return to and reread Siddhartha and The Art of Possibility. It's so funny that I'm like doing this gold theme for the wrap-up portion of this book because the first two books, Siddhartha and House of Flame and Shadow, both had gold prominent figures on the cover. So I switched to a gold theme, even though I meant to do like a cherry blossom theme for this month. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions about these books. Let me know what you are reading, what you've enjoyed, if you have any recommendations. Always up for trying new genres, finding new authors, and reading new books. Thank you so much for watching, and if you've made it this far, leave a gold star emoji in the comments, and I will catch you next time. Bye.